Lieutenant Richard Bong had maybe 4 seconds to live. His wingman's P-38 Lightning was already spiraling into the Pacific. 3 Japanese Zeros had bounced them from above, and now the lead Zero was sliding into firing position behind him. Bong tried the textbook move, hard right bank, full throttle, climb away from the threat. The Zero turned tighter. The Japanese pilot was already lining up his shot. What Bong did next wasn't in any training manual. It violated every principle taught at flight school. His instructors had specifically warned against it. Engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation. Do not do this under any circumstances. Bong rolled his P-38 completely upside down and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from death, he dove straight toward the ocean, inverted. Blood rushed to his head, his vision turned red. For 2 critical seconds, he couldn't see his instruments, couldn't see anything but crimson. When he rolled level again, the Zero was above him, overshooting, completely out of position. Bong had just stumbled onto the tactic that would save hundreds of American lives and reshape air combat across the Pacific. A maneuver so dangerous, so counterintuitive, that aviation medicine said it was impossible to survive. Yet pilots who used it lived, pilots who didn't died. This is the story of how desperate men broke every rule to survive and accidentally rewrote fighter combat doctrine forever. By mid-1942, American pilots were dying at an alarming rate. The mathematics were brutal. Japanese pilots held a 3-to-1 kill ratio in some sectors. The problem had a name, the Mitsubishi A6M0. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter in the sky. Its turning radius was 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning, nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional dogfight, the kind emphasized in every American training program, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside of his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. American pilots tried everything. They dove on Zeros from altitude, fired, then tried to climb away. But if the initial attack missed, the Zero pilot would enter a tight turn. When the American followed, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. Squadron commanders were filing reports that all said the same thing. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The advice was sensible. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage. But combat rarely unfolded according to plan. Why Americans were losing? The tactical crisis was made worse by Japanese pilot skill. Many had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s over China. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. A common Japanese tactic, one Zero would fly straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, 2 more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. Suddenly, the American was defensive, and defensive meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zero's advantages became overwhelming. The mathematics were unforgiving. American fighters carried armor plate behind the pilot seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavier guns. These features kept pilots alive when hit, but they added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and expanded turning radius. American pilots were essentially asked to defeat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting, while flying aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maneuverability. Conventional tactics were getting them killed. The maneuver that would save countless lives didn't come from textbooks or tactical doctrine. It emerged from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The split S involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces, blood pushes toward their feet. At around 5 to 6 Gs, vision narrows and pilots black out. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. The effect is called red out because the visual field literally turns red as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. Aviation medicine in 1942 said humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies indicated even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance: avoid negative G flight entirely. But these studies were conducted in controlled environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. Combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of red-out vision but escaping a zero's gun solution survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight but stayed in the zero's crosshairs died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It was temporary blindness versus permanent death. The physics behind the inverted dive involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a zero pilot achieved a tail position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or climb away, which bled energy and made the American an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot tried to follow, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The zero was stressed for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a zero risked structural failure or engine problems. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage. Unlike single-engine fighters with carbureted engines that could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines functioned more reliably under negative G loads. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive while pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, widening the separation. The human body's tolerance for negative G-forces turned out to be higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots reported the red-out effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split S. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G-flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense: headaches, facial pressure, bloodshot eyes. But survivable. Several pilots noted in debriefings they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron was the first pilot documented to have used the inverted dive deliberately rather than instinctively. Flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, Lynch led a 4-plane patrol when his formation encountered 8 zeros. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated past 400 miles per hour, then rolled level. The zero pilot attempting to follow pulled out early, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. But Lynch didn't just survive, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the engagement. His wingmen, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. What made Lynch's action significant was intentionality. Other pilots had rolled inverted under duress and survived, chalking it up to luck. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching the maneuver to other pilots during informal briefings. The instruction was simple: if a zero gets on your tail and you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. The zero owns the horizontal circle. American fighters own the vertical dive. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units across Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained largely unofficial, not prohibited but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either. Squadron leaders recognized its effectiveness but hesitated to put it in writing. The concern was partly liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training. So it spread through word of mouth, experienced pilots showing newer arrivals how to execute it without documenting the instruction. The 475th Fighter Group, arriving in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, received informal briefings on the inverted dive from veterans. Major Charles MacDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 kills, later credited the split S maneuver with saving his life on at least 3 occasions. His combat reports show a pattern. Engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass if counterattacked during the climb back up, roll inverted and dive away. Reset the engagement on favorable terms. It wasn't elegant dogfighting. It was industrial-strength survival mathematics that happened to produce victory. The physiological cost of negative G flight was something no training manual prepared pilots for. During a typical split S maneuver, pulling -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. Pilots reported an immediate sensation of intense pressure behind the eyes, followed by the red-out effect where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure came from blood vessels in the retina, engorging with blood forced upward by the negative acceleration. For those 2 to 3 seconds, a pilot was effectively flying blind, relying on feel and instrument memory to maintain aircraft control. Flight surgeons documented the physical aftermath. Nearly all pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some had subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days. Severe headaches were universal. The unofficial medical conclusion: the maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of redout, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up. The maneuver required absolute commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his vision cleared, trusting he'd judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to correct. The mathematical calculation became part of survival: never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. The psychological aspect was equally challenging. Human beings have strong instincts against actions that cause pain and sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct. Yet pilots learn to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying. The second time was still frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant aspect of combat flying, like flak, like fuel management, like watching friends die. The body adapted, the mind adapted. What seemed impossible in a training environment became routine when the alternative was a 20 mm cannon shell through the cockpit. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the redout duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively, trading maximum performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to keep some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation, better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened informally, veteran pilots taking new arrivals aside after evening mess, describing what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it, others pretended not to notice, maintaining plausible deniability in case headquarters asked uncomfortable questions. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, incorporated the split S into his unit's tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly outmatched in turning combat against Zeros. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic. He told his pilots explicitly if they tried to turn with a Zero, they'd die. If they used the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, they'd survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft using these tactics. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. Marine Corps F-4. U Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters except turning radius. Marine pilots found the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's powerful engine maintained thrust through negative G maneuvers, and the aircraft's structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without worrying about wing failure. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Fighter pilots received briefings that now included inverted maneuvers as accepted tactics. The official terminology varied. Some called it a split S, others referred to it as a negative G break. Some simply described it as rolling out downward. The language didn't matter. The execution was consistent. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed, invert and dive. The safety threshold remained around 8,000 feet. Below that, pilots were instructed to use other escape options or accept they were in a fight to the death. Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and attempted to develop countermeasures. By late 1943, combat reports mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at high speed. Initial Japanese assessments viewed this as purely defensive, evidence that American pilots feared close combat and were fleeing rather than fighting. This interpretation was strategically dangerous because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine while missing the actual threat. The inverted dive wasn't retreat. It was a reset that allowed American pilots to choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. Some Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives. The results were often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38S through aggressive inverted dives experienced control surface flutter or structural failure. Others found their engines experienced fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, mid-dive, while trying to keep an enemy aircraft in sight. A documented incident over Leyte Gulf illustrated the tactic's lethality. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros. When the lead Zero achieved firing position, Maguire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, attempting to keep Maguire in his gun sight. 2 things happened simultaneously. Maguire's P-38 accelerated past 450 miles per hour while maintaining structural integrity, and the pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibration around 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early or risk airframe failure. Maguire leveled out, climbed back into the fight with superior energy, and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The other 2 disengaged. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their most effective aircraft was optimized for the wrong kind of combat by late 1944. Early in the war, when engagements occurred at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning fights, the Zero's characteristics were ideal. But as American tactics evolved toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant, while its disadvantages, lack of armor, lightweight structure, lower dive speed, became critical vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers recognized this problem. Later Zero variants and newer designs had improved dive performance and stronger structures, but these arrived in limited numbers and too late to change the tactical balance. Japanese training programs couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By 1944, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. New pilots received abbreviated training that emphasized basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics. There wasn't time or fuel to teach advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had incorporated lessons from combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific in late 1944 already knew about inverted dive tactics before they flew their first combat mission. The knowledge gap had reversed. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced in the theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 didn't disappear when World War II ended. They became embedded in fighter tactics doctrine, though often without attribution to the desperate innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll, but the fundamental physics and purpose remain identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over New Guinea in April 1943. The Korean War saw American pilots employing similar tactics against MiG-15S. The Soviet-built jet fighter had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots, facing analogous problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros, used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival in several engagements to rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs. Precisely the same inverted dive concept, now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons the hard way. Early in that conflict, American pilots trained primarily for beyond visual range missile combat found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17S and MiG-21S. The initial engagement results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 represented institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, remained critically important despite technological advances. Instructors taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defensive, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are designed with negative G capability built in. The F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all have fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength that allow sustained negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G-forces. The red-out effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a known and manageable phenomenon. But the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G-flight allows maneuvers that opponents don't anticipate, creating separation and opportunities for counterattack. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels. No aeronautical engineer designed the tactic, no tactical development board approved it, no training command incorporated it into syllabi until after pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of combat engagements. It spread through the warrior network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals, person to person, squadron to squadron. The men who developed these tactics didn't receive recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their improvised solutions would influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war partly because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when circumstances demanded. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the tactic intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944. Not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was statistically lethal regardless of skill. Their legacy isn't in medals or official recognition. It's in the fact that fighter pilots today still train to roll inverted and push negative G when defensive. A direct lineage to desperate innovations made in cockpits over the Pacific, where survival required rewriting the rules mid-flight. Where men learned that sometimes the only way to escape death was to fly straight toward the ground, upside down, blind, trusting that when their vision cleared, they'd still have enough sky beneath them to live another day. The maneuver that broke every rule became the rule that kept them alive.